Chapter 1701. She's stubborn and won't behave. So what if I lock her up for 2 days? Do you feel bad? Sandy looked cold. Brandon frowned. She's your daughter. She stopped what she was doing and looked up. I'm doing this because she's my daughter. She doesn't respect me. Brandon wanted to say something, but the housekeeper walked over anxiously. Ma'am, Miss Vanderbilt is here. Sandy paused, then laughed. I guess the Goldman princess is worried about my daughter. Let her in. Before the housekeeper could invite her, Daisy had already walked in. Where's Freya? She left her manners at the door. Sandy looked at her. Miss Vanderbilt, Faye isn't feeling well and is resting. I don't think she should be entertaining guests. She slowly got up. Have you had lunch? I'll get them to prepare something. I'm not here for lunch. Daisy went straight to the point. You locked up Freya, didn't you? Sandy's expression froze while she looked toward the maid standing at the side. They didn't look up. She's my daughter. So what if I lock her up for a few days when she misbehaves? Miss Vanderbilt, even if you're a Goldman, this is my home, and Freya is my daughter. You're trespassing, so I hope you act smart. Sandy had heard from her son that even though she was a Goldman, she wasn't as ruthless as Lara and was easier to speak to. They wanted to use her because she looked weak and gullible, so it would be easy for them to control her. Report me then. Sandy's face dropped. What? Even if you're Freya's mother, locking people up is illegal too. Go ahead and make your report. I'll even make the call for you. Daisy waved her phone around. You say that I've locked Freya up. What evidence do you have? Here's the evidence. Colton stepped into the living room while the bodyguard behind him helped Freya, who was barely breathing. She couldn't seem to stand on her own. Daisy was shocked upon seeing her in that state. Freya. Sandy's face turned pale. Daisy ran to Freya and raised her hand but was hesitant about touching her. Her clean clothes were covered in blood spots and had turned yellow. The wounds on her skin had pus. With her remaining energy, she said, I'm fine. But she lost consciousness right after saying that. Colton looked at the bodyguard. Send her to the hospital, swiftly. How dare you? Before Sandy could finish, Daisy picked up the vase on the table and threw it at her. The vase broke into a million pieces at her feet. She looked pale as a corpse while Brandon tried to protect her. Even Colton's bodyguards looked at Daisy in shock. You're animals. Daisy yelled, how could you call Freya your daughter? Having you as a mother is the worst thing to happen to her. She doesn't have to live by your ideology. You gave her life, but she should have control over her own life. You have no right to interfere nor kidnap her as her mother. Sandy's face was pale, but she wanted to get some dignity back. Are all Goldman crazy? Chapter 1702. Daisy kicked over the decorations on the cabinet. The Chinese and expensive goods were shattered into pieces. Sandy shook with anger upon seeing her precious collections treated that way. Are you insane? If you want to know if the Goldman is crazy, just look at what happened to the Reeses. Daisy picked up the teapot made of jade from the table. You've been an eyesore for a long time now. I don't understand why an old woman like you is causing trouble, instead of just enjoying the rest of your life. Do you want everyone to know that the illegitimate child of royalty is using her son to climb the social ladder? Her words stabbed straight into her heart. Daisy mocked Sandy, yet she wasn't able to retaliate. Don't you think that I'm easy to manipulate? I'll show you how wild I can be. Daisy loosened her grip, and the expensive jade teapot fell to the floor and split into two. Sandy grabbed her chest and had difficulty breathing. Her voice cracked. Do you know how expensive that is? Daisy wore a sweet smile. I don't have a good concept of money, so I have no idea how expensive it is. She then turned around. Send Freya to the hospital and leave a few men here. She paused for a few seconds. Mess this place up. She can call the police if she wants to. When Sandy heard that and saw the bodyguards beginning to thrash the place, she fainted. News of his home being trashed got to Ken quickly. When he found out that his mother was admitted to the hospital, he immediately rushed over. What happened? Brandon didn't speak while Sandy was furious. I just locked Faye up for 2 days. Someone told Daisy Vanderbilt and that girl brought people over to trash our home. Ken's eyes turned dark when he heard that. Why did you lock her up? Are you blaming me? I did it for you, yelled Sandy. If not because of her, that Goldman girl would have ended up with your man. I was just punishing her. Ken clenched his jaw and took a deep breath. Mom, you're making things worse. I'm making things worse? Sandy lost her temper again. Faye is my daughter. Is it wrong for me to punish her? She was misbehaving. I just wanted her to listen to us. You know how Daisy feels about her. You touched Faye, and she came to seek revenge. Isn't that making things worse? Barked Ken. Sandy looked at him but had nothing to say. He took a deep breath. Mom, you pushed them into the corner. Do you think that's helping me? Sandy couldn't answer. She had been under the impression that Daisy was a softie because she was so protected by her family. That was why she was so daring. However, Sandy didn't expect her to suddenly go crazy. Ian walked in with a newspaper in his hands and stopped next to Ken. Sir, Madam is in the news. Ken took it and looked, then almost tore it up. Sandy took it, and it said that she was violent to her daughter and had locked her up. She was stunned. How did? Ken looked toward Ian. How many have been distributed? Ian awkwardly said, a few magazines have printed tens of thousands of them. Someone seemed to be helping to promote it. All the copies have been sold. I'm afraid it's too late to get them back. The next day, at the hospital, Freya's wounds had been tended. She lay in bed and was slowly recovering from the 2 days of hunger and thirst with the help of 4 drips. Chapter 1703. Daisy walked into the room with a fruit basket. Freya turned to see her. She placed the basket on the counter. I guess you won't be able to attend the anniversary event. You probably need to be here for about half a month more. Freya smiled. Thank you. Don't say that. She sat on the chair. You helped me before. Freya chuckled. I guess we're even then. Soon after that, Daisy walked out of the room and into the busy corridor when she suddenly saw a familiar person. Wasn't that Nole's bodyguard, Edison? She quietly followed them and saw that he was at the hospital's A wing. He entered a room quickly, but what was curious was that there were 2 bodyguards outside that room. Daisy hid behind a wall and couldn't go closer, so she could only wait for someone to exit. After a few minutes, Edison opened the door and walked out. Before the door closed, she saw the person lying in bed. It was Ian. Daisy paused and remembered that Nole had said he was the only one who knew where Ian was. Edison said something to the bodyguards, and then walked to the elevator. After the 2 golden doors closed, Daisy walked out from behind the wall, looked to see which floor it stopped at, and ran toward it through the emergency exit. She got out from the staircase at the garage, where Nole's car was parked. She hid next to a car and quietly moved closer to their car. The window rolled down with Nole sitting in the back seat. Did he agree? Edison nodded. Thanks to that bag of cranberries, he thought that his father was in your hands, and since his father is important to him, he had to agree. Nole squinted and was in deep thought. With him as a witness, it would be much easier to fabricate evidence of Jonah's death. I don't understand why we're not going straight to Ken. We can even let the Goldman handle him. Edison couldn't understand. If Nole took down Ken, he would have plenty of chances. Even if he died in public, nobody would suspect anything. If that didn't work, if Nolan found out that Ken had his eyes on his daughter, it would be a matter of time before he took him out. Nole rapped his knuckles on his lap. Even though my aunt was born of a mistress, she's still my grandpa's daughter. She hated us because she wasn't happy that my mother was the queen's child and could be open about it. if I took Ken out publicly, I would be giving my aunt a reason to complain to the royals. Because Nole was the legitimate princess offspring, he was a young prince. The descendants of his wife would inherit 20% of his grandfather's assets. The illegitimate family would not get anything, and that was why his aunt hated them. Nole rebuilt the Noles without help from his grandfather, who looked forward to what he could do in the future. How could he let Ken's death ruin everything he had worked hard for? Nole looked into the rearview mirror, saw someone, and laughed. Edison was curious. Why are you laughing? As for why I didn't let the Goldman handle this, if one needed my father-in-law to take over, would he still let me marry his daughter? His eyes went elsewhere, and he smiled. If Daisy paid for all my expenses, I wouldn't mind taking their family name. Not having to work hard seems like a good idea. Chapter 1704. When Daisy, who was hiding behind the car, heard that, she stood up. You have no dignity. Edison jumped. Miss Vanderbilt. Daisy quickly walked to the car, leaned on the door, and looked at him. You're planning to live with us, and spend our money, and take everything. Nole chuckled as he stared at her innocent and beautiful face. If the family fortune can survive the three of you, it can survive me too. Daisy puffed up her cheeks. You're trying to say that my brothers and I spend too much money? Nole couldn't help but smile and pinch her cheek. You alone are enough trouble. Why else would you go trash up the Pruitts' home? She paused and suddenly felt ashamed. I was angry. How could that old woman bully her like that? No one noticed that Edison had left. Nole opened the door, pulled her into the car so that she would sit on his lap, and whispered into her ear, How long were you eavesdropping? Daisy was ashamed that she had been caught eavesdropping, so she looked away. Not very long. It wasn't too long, just around 5 or 6 minutes, but she had heard everything she shouldn't have. Nole cupped her cheek. So, you heard everything. She felt guilty. Am I not supposed to hear that? He smiled but didn't answer. Why was Ian admitted? Daisy was worried that he would be angry, so she quickly explained, I was just curious, nothing else. He laughed. Are you concerned about my feelings? Daisy choked. What if you take things the wrong way? Nole tapped the tip of her nose. That's sincere. He wasn't planning on hiding it from her. Ken hired someone to get rid of him. We saved him, but he was already badly injured. Daisy was shocked. Ken wanted to get rid of him? Is it because? She guessed that it was because of what he had done to her, because he was exposed. Nole pushed her hair behind her ear. How's Freya? Daisy looked down. She's badly hurt. The maid sent a text to me with her phone because she would have lost her life. She pouted and tugged his sleeve. Nole, how could her family treat her so cruelly? Freya was her daughter, but Sandy only cared about her son. She would even treat her daughter so cruelly. Nole looked away. It's related to how they were brought up. You know that my aunt is an illegitimate child. She never got to visit the palace, even though she was also a princess. She wasn't treated the same as my mother. Daisy paused. That was the main reason? He smiled and looked at her. Not everyone is able to accept the fact when they go through hardships. But how could she punish her children for her hardships? Even if her life was tough, she had control of her own life. She could have changed it. Daisy couldn't understand. As an illegitimate child, Sandy had done no wrong because her mother had chosen to keep her. Even if her mother had done it for power and status and would rather be a mistress and get chastised for it, what had her children done wrong? Sandy could have changed herself and become a better mother than her mother, but she chose vengeance and punished her children for her misfortune. Nole looked down. People are rarely so wise. If there were more of them, there wouldn't be people who couldn't distinguish between good and evil. To be good or evil is a choice. Chapter 1705. Nole lifted Daisy's chin before touching her forehead with his. Daisy, if one day you realize that I'm someone who would do anything to get what I want, would you be afraid of me? Daisy paused and didn't speak. Nole didn't push her for an answer and let go of her. Are you leaving, or will you spend more time with Freya? I'm going home. She then looked at Nole. I would understand. Nole was surprised. If she said that she wouldn't be afraid, he would think she was just brushing him off, but she said she would understand. Nole sent her to the Hilton Villas. Daisy opened the door, remembered something, and looked back at him. You should keep an eye out for Ken Pruitt too. Nole was momentarily silent before flashing a smile. Yes, ma'am. After watching her go into the villa, Nole stopped smiling, and his face dropped. It's time that I visit my aunt. Sandy was still in the hospital, and her expression changed when she saw Nole enter. What are you doing here? He casually walked into the room and looked around. Am I not welcomed here? Drop the act. Are you here to mock me? Humph. Even if I've offended the Goldmans, I'm still the daughter of the king. The Hathaways and Goldmans had worked together to take the Reeses down, and the royals hadn't interfered because they had nothing to do with them. Even if they were nobility, they had been granted the title a long time ago. The ancestor of the Reeses was the only non-royal to receive a title. If not for that ancestor, the Reeses would not have their status to this day. They would just be someone from high society. Even though she was an illegitimate child with no status, she was still a princess. Nole played around with the roses in the vase and said without looking up, so you're glad that you're grandpa's daughter and won't fall from grace like the Reeses? Sandy smirked. Is it untrue? If they wanted to get to me, they would have already. Nole chuckled. Do you think that Grandpa would go against the Hathaways and Goldmans for you? Sandy screamed, are you mocking me? He calmly turned around to face her. I'm just being honest. The Hathaways provide a lot of military funding every year, and with that, they're pretty much the finance minister. Grandpa is a smart man. He wouldn't take a loss. And the Goldmans don't care who you are. You're a princess, but when you married Uncle Brandon, you pretty much left the royal family. My father married my mother and was accepted by Grandpa, but that was something Uncle Brandon, and you never had the privilege of. The truth was harsh, and Nole was there to expose her wounds. Sandy couldn't take it anymore and pushed everything on the table to the floor. Get out. The food spilled onto his pants, but he just took a look and laughed. Are you afraid to hear the truth? She shook in anger, but was still proud. What are you going to do, Nole? Ken is your cousin. Are you going to get to him? If anything happens to him, can you explain it to your grandfather? All her pride came from her son. So what if she was an illegitimate child? She had royal blood, and so did her son. He was a royal grandchild. If Nole tried to do anything to Ken, she would have her ways to make the Noles pay. The king wouldn't want his own family members taking each other out, so he would lose faith even if it was his only legitimate grandchild. Chapter 1706. Nole knew what she was going to say. A faint smile appeared on his face as he said, I won't do anything to Ken. Sandy let out a snort. Just when she was about to say something, Nole's face turned grim as he continued, but it doesn't mean that other people won't do anything to him. Her face turned pale. What do you mean? She pounced at Nole and grabbed him by his collar tightly. I warn you, Nole. If you dare to lay your finger on my son, I'll make you and your mother experience what it means to live a life worse than death. I guess you should keep that for yourself. Nole pried his collar out of her grip. There was no expression on his face as he continued indifferently. What do you think will happen if everyone learns that it's Ken who killed Mr. Reese? I think it's going to be very interesting. All colors drained from Sandy's face. How does he know about that? Her voice began to tremble as he said, what the hell are you talking about? You don't have any evidence, so. I do, Nole said as he leaned closer to stare at her expressionlessly. I have the evidence, so you know what you should do, right, Aunt Sandy? He turned around and left the ward. Sandy was so scared that she was shaking all over. If Nole had the evidence, things would be very bad for her son. She thought of something and hastily called Ken to inform him. The next day, when the nurse changed the wound dressing, Daisy pushed the door and came into the ward. Freya, my brother, and I. Before she could finish her sentence, she saw Freya taking off her clothes so that the nurse could clean her wound. Freya turned her head to look at them, and Daisy hastily pushed Colton out of the ward. Colton couldn't come around to his senses in time, and he stumbled a few steps when she pushed him out of the door. After that, Daisy hastily closed the door. She felt embarrassed. If she had known that the nurse was changing Freya's dressing on the wound, she wouldn't have brought Colton with her. She turned to look at Colton and asked in a serious voice, "You didn't see anything, right, Colton?" Colton turned his face sideways and replied, "There's nothing much for me to see either." Daisy knew her brother was not that kind of person, and she heaved a sigh of relief. After the nurse had finished her work, she came out of the ward. When Daisy went into the ward, Freya had already put her clothes back on. She was sitting on the bed, and she apparently did not care about what happened just now. "You don't have rehearsal today?" "We're almost done with the rehearsal, so we're taking 2 days of rest." Daisy walked to the bed and sat down. She handed the snack box in her hand to her and said, "I bought you some low-fat cakes. They're healthy and nutritious." Freya took it over and said, "Thank you." Colton stood by the door with his arms across his chest. He looked around the ward and frowned. "Are you sure you can rest in this kind of place?" It had poor sound insulation, and they could hear the sound of the patient watching TV next to them. Not only that, but there were a lot of people walking here and there in the corridor. There was a child crying nonstop while getting an injection. Daisy felt Colton was right. "Do you want to change to another ward?" Freya was rendered speechless. She put the snack box down and said, "That's not necessary. I'm here to treat my wound. I'm not here to enjoy the VIP treatment." Daisy scratched her cheek and felt Freya was right as well. Colton snorted and said, "Idiot. Staying in the hospital itself was suffering, so what's wrong with spending money to enjoy better service?" "No. I'm not as rich as you guys," Daisy chimed in and said in confusion, "but you have a lot of money too." She could easily get tens of thousands of dollars after selling the copyright of her book. Besides, her title was popular. She should be able to enjoy a good life with the amount of money she earns. Freya was stumped. "But it doesn't mean I can spend my money freely. You don't know how hard it is to earn money. Besides, I still need to take care of Dee, remember? Chapter 1707. Daisy fell silent after Freya mentioned Dee. She had to take care of her brother's daughter, so it was true that she couldn't spend her money freely. Colton turned around and said, "You don't have to pay for it." Then, he left the ward. In the end, Freya was forcefully moved to the VIP inpatient department on the 16th floor. Since the ward was located on a higher floor, it received more sunlight. The sound insulation was a lot better, and the corridor was empty. It was not as noisy as the ward downstairs and was a suitable environment for recuperation. Daisy looked at Colton. She was kind of surprised that her brother would spend money on someone other than her. After all, not everyone could make her brother spend money on them. However, she was kind of happy as well. At the very least, Colton had already started to warm up to Freya. Colton received a call and went up to answer it. Freya went closer to her and whispered, "Is there something wrong with your brother's head?" Daisy came around to her senses and looked at her. A smile appeared on her face as he said, "Maybe." "Hold on a second. Will he want me to pay him back the money?" asked Freya. "I don't have that much money." This was the first sentence Colton heard when he entered the ward. He put his phone down and said indifferently, "I don't need you to pay me back the money." Freya let out a sigh of relief. "That's good to hear." "Who called you, Colton?" asked Daisy. Colton replied, "What do you think?" "Of course, it's Nole." Daisy seemed a bit surprised. "Since when did you have Nole's contact number?" She remembered very clearly that Colton did not save Nole's phone number. Besides, he hated Nole a lot, so it went without saying that they wouldn't contact each other by phone. It's none of your business. Colton pulled the door open and turned his head around. I'll come to pick you up at night. After he went away, Daisy said while smacking her lips, I don't know why, but I have a feeling that both of them are doing something behind my back. Freya looked at her and said, I think they're figuring out a plan to get Ken into their trap. It went without saying that they had to get back at Ken after he ordered Ian to do that kind of thing to Daisy. Besides, Colton hadn't told the Goldmans about it yet. If not, it was impossible that they wouldn't have done anything all this while. Although Daisy did not understand why Colton did not want to tell their family about it, she guessed it was because Colton wanted to take the matter into his own hands. He felt it was his negligence that had allowed Ian to lay his hands on Daisy. Besides, he probably did not know how to explain this to his family. Freya lowered her head and chuckled. Your brother is a good brother. She was kind of envious of Daisy. Colton just wanted to protect his sister. He did not care about other people's views at all. Similarly, Ken was her brother. However, their relationship was built on top of their interests, and they rarely cared about each other. Daisy smiled. Waylon and Colton are good brothers. As if she thought of something, she added, but don't worry. Colton might have a sharp tongue, but he's actually a very good man. I can see that. Freya got a pillow behind her and continued. He's so protective of you. I wonder who has the guts to become your sister-in-law in the future. Why would you say that? Asked Daisy. Freya then continued matter-of-factly. After all, I believe that your brother will still put you in the first place even after he has a girlfriend. There is no way a girl can tolerate it. Daisy rested her chin on her hand and said, You're right. I've never seen Colton have any girlfriends before. Could it be that I'm the obstacle in his journey to get a girlfriend? If that were true, she felt she had to do something about it. After all, Colton was handsome. It was such a shame that he did not have a girlfriend. Freya rolled her eyes at her and said, Why are you worrying about something that even your brother himself isn't worried about? I'm just making an assumption. Are you going to force your brother to get into a relationship? Chapter 1708. If Colton blames Daisy for being the obstacle in his journey to get a girlfriend, she would be in big trouble. Daisy smiled but did not say anything. After leaving the ward, she came to the first-floor lobby by elevator. There was a nurse pushing a wheelchair in the crowd, and the young man sitting in the wheelchair was none other than Ian. He looked a lot thinner than the last time she saw her. He had a gaunt face, his body looked emaciated, and there was no light in his eyes. Gone was the energetic Ian. When Daisy's gaze fell on his right empty pant leg, she was stunned. The nurse pushed him past her, but Ian did not notice her. Daisy stopped in her tracks. She turned her head around to look at the figure that was entering the elevator and sank into deep thoughts. Colton was waiting for her outside of the entrance. She pulled the door and went into the car. Colton, do you know what happened to Ian? Colton frowned. Why do you care about him? He had it coming. I'm just curious. Daisy pressed her lips. He must have regretted paying such a high price. Colton turned his head around to look at her. There's no moving back in this world. Daisy suddenly chuckled, and her melancholy a second ago vanished into thin air. Why don't you get a girlfriend, Colton? He was stunned and looked at her with a frown. What? Blinking her eyes, Daisy went closer to him and asked, It isn't because of me, right? Colton knocked on her head. What are you thinking about? Daisy stroked her head and replied, Just answer my question. It has nothing to do with you. I'm not in the mood to look for a girlfriend right now. After Colton finished speaking, he glanced at her. Do you think I'm you? All that's in your mind is Nole. Won't you feel ashamed of yourself? Daisy puffed her cheeks up and replied, It's none of your business either, you leftover. Colton was rendered speechless. As Daisy walked downstairs with her half-dried hair, she found that the housekeeper had just finished making dinner and was setting the table. "Miss, it has been a long time since your boyfriend came to dinner." She chuckled and picked up the fork. "Well, he has been rather busy lately. I can see that he loves you very much. Last time, he clearly told me he had eaten breakfast, but he still sat with you and accompanied you to eat again. He doesn't like broccoli, yet he still eats it when you put one into his plate." Daisy was stunned and raised her head. "How did you know that he doesn't like broccoli?" Even she herself did not know about that. The housekeeper smiled and replied, "I can see that he doesn't like broccoli a lot. Whenever I was cleaning the table, there would be a lot of broccoli left on his plate. He ate those that Daisy put on his plate, but he picked out the broccoli that was originally on his plate. Perhaps he cared about her feelings a lot, so he did not want to reject her." Late at night, at the plastic surgery hospital, Maggie's face sank when she looked at her swollen face. Whenever she saw her face, she felt like vomiting. Ian hugged her from the back. "What's wrong?" Maggie stashed the mirror away and said exasperatedly, "Would you be happy if someone changed your face to another person?" He lowered his eyes. After a short while, he asked, "When you asked me about Ian, did you tell anyone?" Maggie was stunned for a moment, but she soon came around to her senses. She turned around to look at him calmly and asked, "Why? Are you suspecting me?" "Not me," Ian grabbed her hand. "It's Mr. Pruitt. I'm sure you know what he's capable of." Maggie dusted his collar. Although her face was swollen and she did not look like herself anymore, her eyes were alluring. "Are you worried that I might die?" Chapter 1709. Ian pressed his lips into a thin line and did not say anything back in return. "Ian, there's no turning back since we started seeing each other behind his back. Both of us know what he is capable of. Anyone can become his tool. If we continue to work for him, it'll only be a matter of time before he discards both of us." She put her finger on his lips and continued. "Besides, can you tolerate it if he's going to offer the woman you love the most to that brutal man?" Ian took a deep breath to calm himself down. After a short while, he released her and turned around to walk to the door. He stopped in front of the door and said without turning his head, "I'll try my best to stop it." Maggie watched as he left the room. Ian came to the parking lot. He had been very alert and instantly sensed something. He spun around, but he was still a step slower. Holding him at gunpoint, Edison said, "My master wishes to see you." Ian looked toward the car that was parked not far away, and his face sank. After Ian got into the car, the curtains fell and blocked all the windows. At the same time, Edison turned off the headlights. Nole was sitting with his legs crossed. "Does Mr. Pruitt know that you're here to meet your lover, Mr. Templar?" Ian gnashed his teeth and said, "That's not true. Maggie has already joined my side." Ian was stunned, and understanding soon dawned upon him. It was only now he realized why Ken's assassination plan had failed. It turned out that Maggie was the one who had exposed their plan, and he was the one who had told those plans to her. "I want to make a deal with you, Mr. Templar." Nole turned his head to look at him and smiled. "What makes you think that I'll betray Mr. Pruitt?" Ian looked at him back. Even though the rumored Nole was 10 years younger than him and an inexperienced young man, he was much more mature than his peers. He was shrouded in an air of mystery and had a pair of eyes that seemed to be able to see through everything. These were the things that he shouldn't have at his age. Ian remembered a saying. Those who had seen hell wouldn't believe in heaven anymore. It occurred to him that the young man before him was as complicated as he was. Nole then said calmly, "Maggie. Are you threatening her?" "I showed her a path where she could live the life she wanted, so she decided to join my side," Nole said calmly as he retracted his gaze. "You don't wish to see her die in the hands of Ken, right?" Ian fell silent. Nole continued calmly. "After everything is settled, you can bring her away. You too can live the life you want. You don't have to work for other people anymore." Ian began to waver when he heard that he could have both freedom and the woman he loved. 2 days later. Brandon came to look for Freya at the hospital. Apparently, he came here because of Sandy. I know your mother doesn't treat you well, but she's still your mother. How can you bear to see her become the laughingstock of the city? Sandy had appeared on the news headlines because she abused and confined her daughter. Several days later, a group of reporters came to their house and wanted to interview her. Everyone was criticizing Sandy. They were throwing all sorts of bad comments at Sandy on the internet, and the good reputation that Ken had built up through Lara had been affected by the incident as well. Brandon walked up to Freya when she did not say anything. He grabbed her shoulder and said, "Faye, you need to understand your mother." When Freya heard what her father said, her heart shattered. She slowly lifted her head and looked at her father expressionlessly. "Instead of apologizing to me, you expect me to be understanding?" Brandon was stunned and lowered his head. Freya pushed her father away and shouted, "If I try to understand her, then who's going to understand me? You guys wanted me to suspend my studies to raise the child that Ken abandoned, despite my reputation. Is Ken all you two cares about? What about me? Am I not your child?" "Faye. Shut up." She interrupted him before he could finish his sentence. She calmed herself down and said, "Dad, since you don't consider me as your daughter, then from today onward, I'm cutting ties with you. It's none of my business whether she's dead or alive." Chapter 1710. Brandon's pupils constricted as he did not expect such words would come out of her mouth. "Please go back. I want to rest." She pulled the cover and lay down with her back facing the door. When she heard the door close, a tear dropped from the corner of her eyes. She could vaguely remember that when she was a child, her father would let her ride on his shoulders as both of them walked down the paths of the fields at dusk. It was not that her father was bad. It was just that her father was weak-willed and listened to everything her mother said. Her mother was a strong woman, while her father was weak, and this was the ultimate reason for their estranged relationship. When she heard that someone was coming in, she thought her father hadn't left yet. "Didn't I tell you to leave me alone? Who came here just now?" Freya was stunned. She turned her head around to see Colton standing at the door. She got up from her bed, and her sadness melted from her face. "Nope, no one. By the way, what are you doing here? Daisy was worried that you might get bored, so she asked me to bring your stuff to you." Colton put her backpack on the table. Freya was taken aback. She had left her backpack in the dormitory, and she had been thinking about how to get it back. She did not expect that Daisy would see through her intention. She took over the backpack and rummaged through it. Soon, she found the laptop that she had used to write her novel. "Thank you for bringing my stuff here, Colton." She switched on her laptop, and thankfully, all of her drafts were still there. Colton's phone rang. It was a call from Daisy, and he picked it up in front of Freya. Even though Daisy was not talking loudly, everyone could hear her voice since it was quiet in the ward. "Have you sent the stuff to Freya, Colton?" "Yeah," he replied simply. "Remember to tell Freya that I'll visit after I've finished my class. And please be nice to her," she reminded Colton. She probably was worried that her brother would get into a fight with Freya again. Colton did not know why, but Daisy made it sound like he was going to bully Freya, so he frowned. He glanced across Freya. Freya was looking at her laptop with rapt attention. Her fingers were dancing rapidly on the keyboard as she was totally immersed in her own world. She might not even talk to him, so he doubted they would get into a fight. He hung up the call and retracted his gaze. "I'm leaving." "Okay," she replied without raising her head. After Colton left the ward, Freya lifted her head to look at the door and repeatedly deleted the sentences she had typed in just now. At the college. After Daisy finished all her classes, she came out of the building. She ran toward Nole when she saw him coming down from his car. She couldn't stop herself in time and rammed straight into his arms. Nole stretched his arms forward to catch her and chuckled. "Did you miss me that much?" She buried her head in his chest and did not say anything. Nole stroked the top of her head and asked, "Are you going to the hospital?" She nodded. Suddenly, Nole leaned forward and kissed her ear. His hot and humid breath caused her body to tremble slightly, and she jumped away from his arms. "What are you doing?" He chuckled. "I thought you were not going to talk to me anymore." She was stumped. "I did not." She couldn't stop burying herself in his chest when she saw him. The things that the housekeeper had said about how much Nole loved her surfaced in her heart. "Are you not a fan of broccoli?" Nole was stunned. "Why are you asking?" Daisy put her hands on her waist and continued. "If you don't like it, you should have told me. Even my housekeeper knows that you don't like broccoli, while I don't know about it." Her voice was getting smaller and smaller toward the end of her sentence. After all, she indeed did not know about it. Nole noticed something and smiled. "Is this what you're worried about?"